The humid dawn clung to the jagged coral ridges like a shroud on the morning of March 19th, 1945. The air was thick with the smell of salt, sweat, and the faint tang of spent gunpowder from yesterday's skirmishes. The island had been under American bombardment for days, each shell tearing up the volcanic rock and forcing the Japanese defenders deeper into the jungle. On the ridge above, 300 Marines crouched low in carefully dug foxholes, the ground around them littered with spent cartridges and the occasional scorched fragment of equipment. They were exhausted, thin from weeks of combat, and still wary. Through the dense fog of morning, they could just make out movement figures slipping along the ridges, shadows blending with the greenery. According to intercepted communications and patrol reports, roughly 300 Japanese infantrymen were maneuvering to surround them. The enemy believed themselves to be the hunters. What they did not understand was that they were stepping into a trap of their own making. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sergeant Paul Harper wiped the sweat from his brow and adjusted the sling on his M1 rifle. He was only 24, recently assigned from a replacement depot in San Diego, but the island had transformed him into something sharper, more focused. He glanced at the man beside him, a private barely out of boot camp, and nodded. "They think they've got us," Harper whispered, his voice low, almost lost in the humidity. "Let 'em come." There was no bravado in his words, only the quiet confidence of men who had faced impossible odds and survived. Across the line, other Marines were doing the same, checking magazines, reinforcing sandbag positions, quietly speaking in clipped tones to their neighbors. They were not nervous. They were ready. The Japanese command believed that the American position was untenable. They had done their calculations carefully. Over the last several weeks, intelligence officers had mapped the terrain, counted the enemy numbers, and noted supply lines. 300 Marines, isolated, poorly supplied, and cornered on a narrow ridge. The tactical manuals were clear. Surround and annihilate. The doctrine of encirclement, inherited from centuries of military thinking and reinforced by their own experience on other islands, left no room for negotiation. The Americans, if they were cornered, would either surrender or die in predictable patterns. That was the assumption. That was the plan. But the Americans had a different understanding of warfare. They had learned through bitter experience in the Solomon Islands, Saipan, and Peleliu that the jungle itself could be weaponized. Each tree, each ridge, each narrow coral outcropping was studied, measured, and turned into a defensive advantage. The Marines had cleared firing lanes through dense undergrowth, dug interlocking foxholes, and pre-registered artillery and mortar zones on every approach. Observation posts had been placed at key intervals, manned by men trained to see, hear, and anticipate the slightest movement. Wire obstacles and mines limited but strategically placed would slow the attackers, channeling them into zones where machine guns and mortars could maximize effect. They had turned what appeared to be a trap into a carefully constructed kill zone. Sergeant Harper glanced down the ridge at Corporal David Finch, who was adjusting the traverse on his Browning M 1917. The water-cooled machine gun, a relic from a previous war, weighed 41 pounds without its tripod, but it could sustain a rate of fire that shredded infantry formations at ranges up to 500 yards. Finch's hands were steady, his movements practiced and precise, honed over months of combat on other Pacific islands. Nearby, Private First Class Robert Mard, only 3 weeks from stateside training, sat with his Springfield rifle cleaned and loaded, bayonet fixed. The jungle had already stripped away the naive look from his eyes, leaving behind a quiet vigilance. The air itself seemed alive, vibrating with anticipation. The Japanese had chosen the night to move. Darkness was their ally, and they counted on it to cover their approach. They had perfected the art of silent movement through the jungle, using natural paths and narrow trails known only to experienced guides. Their plan called for a coordinated assault from multiple directions, designed to overwhelm the Americans through sheer numbers and the psychological impact of attacking in complete darkness. Lieutenant General Takashi, commanding from a nearby observation post, believed he had set a trap that would result in decisive victory. The Americans were isolated, outnumbered, and, in his estimation, already cornered. The first Japanese mortar rounds fell at approximately 3:45 in the morning, screaming through the humid night air. Explosions erupted along the ridge, shaking the ground beneath the Marines' feet and tearing up the dense vegetation around them. Harper pressed himself into the mud, feeling the ground shudder as fragments of rock and debris showered around him. At the command post, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Wenzel monitored the situation, his hands steady on the field radio. Reports came in from every sector. The northern perimeter was holding, though mortar fire had landed close to 3rd Battalion. The eastern slope had encountered infiltration, but Marines there were organized and responding with disciplined fire. Wenzel had fought through multiple campaigns. He understood that panic in the first minutes could collapse a defense faster than bullets, and panic did not exist among these Marines. Through the dense mist, the shadows of Japanese infantry could be seen advancing in 3 distinct waves, each larger than the last. They expected surprise, confusion, and a quick collapse of the defenders. Instead, the Americans responded with interlocking patterns of fire. Machine gun teams opened up, their barrels glinting briefly in the pre-dawn light as water-cooled systems hissed and spat spent casings. The Browning M1917S delivered sustained, disciplined fire at rates the Japanese had not anticipated. Every movement was countered with precision. Every attempt to find a weak point was met by a Marine reinforcing the threatened sector without waiting for orders. Wenzel moved along the ridge, checking foxholes, speaking quietly with squad leaders. He noted the discipline, the cohesion, and the methodical coordination of his men. "Hold steady," he murmured, though he needed to say nothing. They knew their role, understood the stakes, and acted instinctively. In a small clearing, Harper watched as a squad cut through undergrowth to reinforce a position under heavy fire, bayonets at the ready. There was no hesitation, only a practiced fluidity born of repeated drills and brutal combat experience. By 4:30 in the morning, the first wave of Japanese infantry had reached the outer wire of the Marine defensive perimeter. They advanced through terrain considered impassable for organized units, using narrow jungle paths and ridges not marked on maps. The assault should have achieved total tactical surprise. Instead, the attackers were funneled into pre-cleared kill zones. Mortars landed in empty spaces as American crews had repositioned their artillery overnight to secondary positions undetectable from Japanese intelligence. Forward observers called in coordinates through encrypted channels, directing devastating counterfire onto enemy formations. The Japanese had committed nearly their entire reserve to this assault, confident that the Americans, exhausted and isolated, would crumble. They had studied the enemy, mapped their movements, and analyzed previous, defensive engagements. What they had not accounted for was the American psychology. These were men who had decided, if surrounded, they would not flee. If outnumbered, they would not surrender. The refusal to retreat became a weapon in itself. By 5:15, the second wave pressed forward, attempting to exploit gaps that should have appeared after the first assault. The gaps did not appear. Each sector that came under pressure grew stronger, reinforced immediately by adjacent squads. Machine guns, mortars, and rifle fire combined in a methodical rhythm, breaking enemy formations and creating zones of lethal fire. By 6 o'clock, Japanese commanders reported heavy casualties, but still expected the Americans to weaken under continuous assault. They did not understand the intensity born of desperation and experience combined. Amid the chaos, Sergeant Harper observed a wounded Marine returning fire from a shallow trench. Blood streaked across his face, yet hands steady. "Hold the line," Harper muttered, almost as if the words would travel down the ridge itself. It was not the orders that held them. It was the culture of trained initiative, of shared understanding and resilience. Each man knew the ridge was the thin line between holding the island and total disaster. Every step forward by the Japanese would be repelled, every attempt to breach the perimeter nullified by prepared fire. At 7 o'clock, the Japanese were in disarray. The terrain they had counted on to shield them had become their own trap. They had underestimated the firepower, the coordination, and the psychological resolve of the Marines. Reports later confirmed nearly 600 Japanese killed in the first wave alone, with staggering numbers wounded or retreating. The Marines had held their position, their casualties comparatively minimal, and the ridge remained in American hands. By mid-morning, the second day of fighting began. Artillery fire was heavier, mortars more precise, but the Americans had anticipated this. Supply drops had been coordinated, ammunition rationed effectively, and the pre-established fallback points allowed for continuous defensive rotation. Marines moved between positions, relieving the fatigued and reinforcing critical points. Japanese forces, exhausted and demoralized from the first day, attempted to reorganize, but every attempt was met with disciplined counterfire. Over 48 hours, the enemy would lose roughly 1,800 men in total, while the Marines' own casualties remained a fraction of that, testament to preparation, training, and psychological resolve. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By the end of the engagement, what had started as a perceived trap had been transformed into a decisive victory. The Japanese had believed that surrounding a small American force would ensure its destruction. Instead, the Americans had turned the tactical assumption upside down, leveraging it into a devastating counter-assault without leaving their defensive line. The irony was clear. The trap they had set became their own undoing. Sergeant Harper, sitting exhausted in his foxhole after the last firefight, looked out over the ridge. The bodies of the enemy were strewn across the paths they had used, a grim testament to planning and discipline. The ridge was quiet now, except for the occasional cough of a wounded man or the creak of equipment settling in the heat. Harper understood, in a way that could never be taught, that the battle was not merely fought with weapons and tactics, but with resolve, ingenuity, and the refusal to conform to the assumptions of the enemy. As dawn broke on the third day, the ridge was still in American hands, the Marines still alive, and the Japanese retreating in disorder. Across the island, reports of the encounter would filter upward, analyzed by staff officers who had underestimated the determination of isolated units. This was not just a tactical victory. It was a demonstration of a psychological principle that would repeat across the Pacific. The cornered Marine is not a defeated one. He is a focused, lethal force, exploiting every miscalculation of the enemy. The day after the initial engagement dawned with a tense calm over the ridge. The Marines were alert, but the chaos of the previous 48 hours had left deep marks. Ammunition had been rationed meticulously, every round counted, every weapon maintained with obsessive care. Supply drops had arrived overnight, coordinated to land in pre-cleared zones, ensuring that the men remained capable of sustaining another wave of enemy attacks if necessary. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Wenzel moved along the perimeter, inspecting positions, speaking quietly to squad leaders, and noting the exhaustion etched into every face. The men's movements were deliberate, their discipline unwavering. Despite the lull, the Japanese forces remained active in the surrounding jungle. Smaller units attempted to infiltrate along unseen trails, hoping to catch the Americans off guard. These patrols were met with precision fire. Corporal Finch, still manning his Browning M1000 917, kept his eyes trained on a narrow approach between two coral outcroppings. The jungle around him was dense, but he had learned its subtle signs, the snapping of a twig, the whisper of leaves, the faint sound of footsteps muffled by the humid soil. Each sound was catalogued, analyzed, and responded to without hesitation. The Japanese were disoriented. The first assaults, which had been designed to crush the Marines in a single, overwhelming strike, had instead decimated their forces. Commanders reported confusion, communication breakdowns, and staggering casualties. They were learning, too late, that the Americans did not respond to pressure in predictable ways, where European doctrine might anticipate surrender or retreat when a unit was cornered. The Marines had shown that concentrated resolve and adaptive tactics could turn a defensive position into a lethal trap. By mid-morning, the Japanese attempted a renewed assault along the southern approach, moving in smaller, staggered groups designed to test weak points. Harper observed from his foxhole as two squads tried to advance through a narrow corridor the Marines had carefully cleared. The interlocking fields of machine gun fire cut them down with brutal efficiency. Even as the attackers fell, others tried to maneuver along the edges, only to run into concealed mortars and riflemen in overlapping sectors. It was a methodical destruction, almost surgical in its precision. The terrain itself became a silent ally for the Marines. The coral ridges, initially seen as mere obstacles by Japanese intelligence, had been integrated into defensive plans. Every rise and depression provided cover, firing angles, and lines of observation. Paths that appeared navigable on maps were, in reality, channels that led directly into concentrated fire zones. Each attack that advanced through the jungle funneled the enemy into positions where concentrated American fire would be maximized. The Japanese soldiers were learning, too late, that the ridge itself was not just a line of defense, it was a weapon. By afternoon, the full scope of the American defensive effort became clear. Marine artillery had been repositioned overnight, and their fire was coordinated through encrypted radio channels with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Shells rained down on enemy positions, disrupting attempts to regroup and cutting off potential reinforcements. Every mortar round, every machine gun burst, every rifle shot was calculated, conserving resources while maximizing impact. The Japanese forces had committed the bulk of their strength, and the attrition was evident in the staggering casualty reports that filtered back to their commanders. Private First Class Robert Mard, who had barely been on the island a month prior, moved through the foxholes with other replacements, redistributing ammunition and checking the wounded. The young Marine's eyes, once wide with the naivety of boot camp, were now sharpened by experience. He moved with a fluid efficiency that came only from facing constant danger, and he understood the rhythm of the ridge, the pattern of fire, the timing of artillery, the subtle signals that indicated enemy movement. By the evening of the second day, Japanese attempts at coordinated attacks had effectively ceased. Small, desperate groups tried to infiltrate, but the Marines' overlapping positions, pre-cleared kill zones, and disciplined counterfire rendered these efforts futile. Lieutenant Colonel Wenzel, surveying the ridge from the command post, noted the unusual quiet. There was no celebratory relief among the men, only the recognition that they had endured, that their discipline and preparation had prevented what the enemy expected to be inevitable. Casualty reports indicated that approximately 1,800 Japanese soldiers had been killed or wounded during the 48-hour engagement, while Marine casualties had remained minimal in comparison. The aftermath of the battle was more than just tactical, it was psychological, both for the Marines and for their adversaries. Harper and his comrades sat in their foxholes, exhausted, tending to the wounded and cleaning their weapons. There was a quiet pride in the knowledge that their training, initiative, and coordination had turned a potentially disastrous situation into a decisive victory. The Japanese command, meanwhile, faced the reality that their doctrine had failed, that the assumptions upon which their plans were built had been shattered. What they had believed was a trapped, isolated force was, in fact, a concentrated and lethal one. In the following days, patrols moved cautiously through the ridge and surrounding jungle, ensuring that the Japanese were no longer able to mount organized counterattacks. The Marines consolidated their positions, repaired equipment, and documented the battle meticulously. Every detail, the placement of foxholes, the angles of fire, the timing of artillery would be recorded for future campaigns. It was clear that the principles demonstrated on the ridge would have implications far beyond this single engagement. They represented a psychological lesson, that determination, preparation, and adaptability could overturn numerical disadvantage and conventional assumptions. For Sergeant Harper, the experience was transformative. He had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the disciplined application of skill and resolve under pressure. Every Marine on the ridge had faced similar realizations. Even the youngest replacement, Mard, would carry this understanding forward, hardened and sharpened by the encounter. Their success was not accidental. It was the product of rigorous training, careful planning, and an unwavering belief in their ability to adapt and survive. The Japanese soldiers who had survived the assault retreated into the jungle, broken and disoriented. Their commanders struggled to rebuild units, decimated by accurate, concentrated fire. The failure was a stark lesson in underestimating the resilience and adaptability of the American Marine. Across the Pacific, intelligence reports would begin to circulate about the ability of small, isolated units to hold positions against far superior numbers, a lesson that would be observed and studied in subsequent campaigns. The ridge, quiet once more, bore the scars of battle, torn earth, spent ammunition, and the remnants of fortifications. Yet it also bore the mark of resilience. Each foxhole, each sandbag, each carefully cleared field of fire was a testament to preparation, discipline, and the courage of the men who had held the line. For Wenzel and Harper, the ridge was more than a tactical victory. It was a proof of principle. Even against overwhelming odds, a determined, well-prepared force could defy expectations, shatter assumptions, and emerge victorious. In reflecting on the engagement, historians would later note that the Japanese had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of American forces in the Pacific. They had assumed that encirclement would force retreat or surrender, as it might have with European units. Instead, they had encountered a doctrine of initiative, adaptability, and relentless resolve. The ridge was a microcosm of a larger strategic pattern, demonstrating the unique psychological and operational approach of the Marines during the Pacific War. By the third day, supply lines were stabilized, artillery positions reinforced, and the Marines were prepared for any further attempts to dislodge them. The enemy, having suffered catastrophic losses, refrained from direct assaults, resorting instead to scattered harassment that could not threaten the integrity of the ridge. The Americans had turned what was supposed to be a moment of vulnerability into a defining triumph, a small but significant demonstration of the broader dynamics of the Pacific campaign. The victory at the ridge became part of the collective memory of the unit, a story of preparation, resolve, and the power of disciplined initiative. Harper, Mard, Finch, and Wenzel would carry the lessons of the engagement forward, applying them in subsequent battles, shaping both their own leadership and the operational approach of the units around them. In every report, every journal, and every debrief, the story of 300 Marines holding against overwhelming odds would serve as a reminder of what could be achieved when training, courage, and ingenuity converged. By the time the sun fully rose on the third day, the ridge had been secured, the Marines rested, and the enemy force neutralized. The Japanese had lost roughly 1,800 men in just 48 hours, a staggering figure that reflected both the ferocity of the fighting and the meticulous planning of the defenders. The Americans had sustained comparatively minimal losses, and the ridge remained firmly in their control. The psychological impact of the battle would ripple outward, reinforcing the notion that American units, even when isolated and outnumbered, could leverage preparation, firepower, and morale into decisive tactical victories. The battle was over, but its lessons endured. It demonstrated the combination of psychological resolve, detailed preparation, and tactical flexibility that defined the American approach in the Pacific theater. For the Marines, it was a validation of their training and doctrine. For the Japanese, it was a cautionary tale about assumptions, underestimation, and the consequences of facing an enemy who would not bend to conventional expectations. In the quiet moments after the engagement, as the men cleaned weapons, treated the wounded, and surveyed the ridge, there was a shared understanding that they had achieved something remarkable, not merely surviving, but turning the expectations of their enemy into their own advantage. In the days and weeks following the engagement, the ridge became a symbol for both the Marines who held it and the commanders studying its outcomes. Patrols confirmed that the Japanese had withdrawn in disarray, their units shattered by the precision and discipline of the defenders. The terrain, once seen as neutral ground, was now firmly under American control. Every foxhole, every cleared path, every strategically placed machine gun stood as a testament to the labor, ingenuity, and courage of those who had fought and survived. For Lieutenant Colonel Edward Wenzel, the victory was both professional and deeply personal. He had witnessed the transformation of inexperienced replacements into Marines capable of executing complex, defensive tactics under extreme pressure. Men like Private First Class Robert Mard, whose first days on the ridge had been fraught with fear and uncertainty, now moved with measured confidence, understanding the rhythm of fire, the value of observation, and the lethal consequences of discipline. Wenzel reflected on the psychological dimension of the battle, the stark contrast between expectation and reality. The Japanese had assumed that 300 Marines, encircled and outnumbered, would be annihilated. Instead, they faced a concentrated, adaptive, and relentless force that leveraged every advantage available. The battle also revealed broader truths about the Pacific War. Many Japanese commanders were trained in doctrine that emphasized overwhelming frontal attacks, rapid maneuver, and psychological intimidation. They had studied American tactics, but often through the lens of European conventions. Encirclement, in their understanding, should compel surrender or induce retreat. The ridge demonstrated a fundamental miscalculation. The Americans' willingness to hold, to adapt, and to employ a combination of individual initiative and coordinated firepower could overturn even the most carefully calculated enemy plan. Historians would later point to the ridge as a microcosm of the broader Pacific campaign. Across countless islands, Marines confronted similar challenges: dense jungle, difficult terrain, and numerically superior forces. The principles that had been validated in this engagement: meticulous preparation, overlapping fields of fire, decentralized decision-making, and a psychological resilience grounded in training became templates for success in subsequent operations. The story of 300 Marines holding against overwhelming odds was not simply an anecdote. It was a model of operational art under the pressures of jungle warfare. In the immediate aftermath, the Marines focused on recovery and consolidation. Wounded men were evacuated under protective fire, equipment was maintained, and ammunition levels were replenished. Supply lines, carefully secured during the engagement, were reinforced to ensure readiness for future operations. Lieutenant Colonel Wenzel ordered patrols to clear surrounding areas of lingering enemy forces, and intelligence teams documented every aspect of the Japanese assault. This meticulous attention to detail ensured that lessons learned on the ridge could inform future campaigns, both tactically and psychologically. Among the Marines, there was a quiet, shared understanding of the magnitude of what had been accomplished. Sergeant Harper, sitting in a dugout as dusk settled over the ridge, reflected on the ordeal. He thought of the hundreds of Japanese soldiers whose advance had been halted, of the precision and coordination that had saved countless lives, and of the psychological resilience that had allowed 300 men to stand firm under unimaginable pressure. The battle was over, but its deep impact lingered, both on the men who had fought it and on the broader course of the war. The Japanese command faced a harsh reckoning. Reports filtered back detailing the staggering casualties, approximately 1,800 men lost in less than 48 hours, and the complete failure of a strategy that had been built on assumptions about enemy behavior. For many commanders, the engagement was a sobering lesson. American forces could not be cornered, could not be relied upon to conform to conventional expectations, and could turn disadvantage into advantage with methodical planning and unyielding resolve. In the larger strategic picture, the ridge illustrated a recurring pattern in the Pacific theater, that smaller, well-prepared American units could hold against numerically superior forces through a combination of discipline, terrain exploitation, and adaptive tactics. These engagements collectively undermined Japanese operational confidence, forcing adjustments to doctrine and compelling a more cautious approach in subsequent battles. For the Marines, the psychological affirmation was equally important. Each successful defense reinforced confidence in training, leadership, and the ability of small units to impact larger operational outcomes. The legacy of the ridge endured in both written histories and oral memoirs. Wenzel, Harper, Mard, and countless others would recount the engagement for decades, emphasizing the human dimension, the fear, the the determination, the ingenuity, and the camaraderie that had sustained them. Training programs incorporated these lessons, reinforcing the principle that preparation and initiative could overcome numerical disadvantage. Manuals and briefings highlighted the importance of overlapping fire, reconnaissance, and rapid adaptation to unexpected developments. The engagement became a case study in the efficacy of disciplined, decentralized command in the chaos of battle. Beyond the tactical and operational lessons, the ridge represented a profound psychological insight. The assumptions of an adversary are only as reliable as their understanding of human resolve. The Japanese had assumed that encirclement would compel retreat. They were wrong. The Americans had demonstrated that steadfastness, discipline, and coordinated adaptability could transform vulnerability into advantage. It was a lesson that resonated across the Pacific, shaping both planning and morale in subsequent operations. By the end of 1944, as the broader campaigns of the Pacific continued, the ridge stood as a symbol of resilience and tactical ingenuity. The engagement was neither the largest nor the most famous of the war, but it exemplified qualities that defined American success in the theater: meticulous preparation, individual initiative, adaptive leadership, and the capacity to exploit both terrain and enemy assumptions. The 300 Marines had faced annihilation and, through discipline and courage, had rewritten the expectations of their adversaries. In the quiet after the battle, as supplies were replenished and patrols secured the perimeter, the men of the ridge reflected on what they had achieved. They had held, they had survived, and they had inflicted devastating losses on a force that had believed them doomed. The ridge would remain a physical feature of the island, scarred but enduring, much like the men who had fought there. It was a reminder that in war, as in life, preparation, courage, and adaptability could overcome even the most daunting challenges. And so, the story of the ridge, of 300 Marines who turned encirclement into triumph, became part of the collective memory of the Pacific War. It was a story of human ingenuity, psychological fortitude, and the relentless application of skill under pressure. For historians, it illustrated the interplay of doctrine, terrain, and morale. For the men who lived it, it was proof that even against overwhelming odds, disciplined action and unwavering resolve could redefine the limits of possibility. The ridge, quiet once more, bore witness not only to the violence of battle, but to the enduring lesson it had taught, that preparation and courage, exercised consistently and intelligently, could transform desperation into victory. And in that transformation, the Marines had not only survived, they had set a standard for what it meant to confront the impossible and emerge not merely intact, but triumphant. Long after the ridge was secured, historians and military analysts returned repeatedly to that engagement, dissecting every detail to understand why such a small force could inflict catastrophic losses on an opponent that outnumbered them 6-1. What became immediately clear was that the battle was not won simply by courage. It was won by preparation, observation, and adaptation. Every rifle pit, every concealed machine gun emplacement, every minor obstacle had been calculated for maximum effect. The Marines' ability to anticipate the enemy's approach, to read the subtle cues of movement through dense jungle, and to exploit the terrain turned a tactical disadvantage into a decisive advantage. First-hand accounts collected from survivors years later reveal another dimension to the story: the psychological endurance of the Marines under sustained pressure. In letters home and oral interviews, men described the hum of tension that ran along the ridge. Sleep was impossible, yet they remained alert. The noise of jungle life, the croak of frogs, the rustle of leaves could easily mask the approach of enemy soldiers, and many Marines recounted the intense concentration required to distinguish natural sounds from the footfalls of attackers. The combination of adrenaline, training, and sheer willpower became a force multiplier, allowing 300 men to behave like an entire division in their defensive efficiency. Lieutenant Colonel Wenzel, in later debriefings, emphasized that much of the Japanese failure stemmed from misjudgments at multiple levels of command. Japanese doctrine emphasized aggressive frontal assault and the element of shock, assuming that overwhelming firepower would force surrender or scatter. However, the Ridge engagement demonstrated that American Marines, when properly trained and supported by overlapping fields of fire and well-coordinated artillery, could absorb such assaults and respond with lethal precision. Wenzel often cited the coordination between artillery and infantry as the single most critical factor. Even under darkness and continuous mortar fire, communication remained intact. Observers in concealed positions relayed coordinates with remarkable accuracy, and counter-battery fire neutralized Japanese mortars before they could wreak sustained damage. This integration of observation, communication, and execution exemplified a new model of small unit operational art. The Japanese units involved paid a steep price. Recovered battle reports indicate that nearly every regiment involved suffered devastating casualties, with some companies losing more than 70% of their effective strength. Officers who survived described the demoralizing effect of repeated failed assaults and the inability to break the American perimeter. Propaganda and expectation, which had long emphasized the invincibility of Japanese soldiers, clashed violently with the reality they encountered. Disciplined Marines, calmly adjusting positions, reinforcing weak points, and maintaining coordinated fire even as chaos raged around them. The contrast between anticipated success and actual results was both shocking and instructive for Japanese command. For the Marines, the Ridge engagement became a defining experience. It was a lesson in leadership under duress and the importance of trust between officers and enlisted men. Sergeant Major William Hayes, later reflecting on the action, described how small decisions, a slight adjustment of a machine gun, the timing of a grenade throw, the repositioning of a patrol, cumulatively determined the outcome of the battle. No single heroic act won the day. Rather, it was the disciplined execution of many small acts, each guided by training, initiative, and a clear understanding of objectives. The logistical realities of the Ridge also played a critical role. Supply chains, while constrained by the island's isolation, had been meticulously maintained. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies were rationed and prioritized based on predicted consumption. Water was scarce, and the humid environment accelerated fatigue and disease, yet officers ensured that men received adequate hydration and rest rotations wherever possible. Even the management of minor injuries was critical. A small wound, left untreated in such conditions, could easily incapacitate a soldier. The meticulous attention to these details ensured that the fighting force remained effective despite intense pressure and extreme environmental challenges. Looking beyond the immediate battle, the Ridge had strategic implications that rippled across the Pacific theater. Japanese commanders were forced to reconsider the viability of aggressive, numerically overwhelming assaults against well-prepared American positions. Subsequent operations reflected increased caution, with Japanese forces often opting for attrition tactics rather than direct frontal assaults. Conversely, the Americans had reinforced their understanding that preparation, discipline, and initiative could consistently turn numerical inferiority into operational advantage. The Ridge became an example in training manuals, a cautionary tale for enemy forces, and a source of pride and instruction for new recruits arriving in the Pacific. The engagement also highlighted the interplay of morale and perception in combat. Many of the Marines recounted that knowing the enemy expected them to break or surrender paradoxically strengthened their resolve. The psychological shock of outnumbered but unyielding defenders, when observed by enemy forces, amplified the Marines' tactical impact. Each repelled attack not only inflicted casualties, but also undermined enemy confidence, creating a cascading effect that contributed to the rapid collapse of Japanese assaults. This phenomenon, a smaller, disciplined force, shaping the behavior of a larger opponent through precision, resolve, and psychological leverage, would be studied and referenced in military circles long after the war. In personal accounts, the human cost of the battle remained clear. The Marines were not spared from fear or loss. Many witnessed comrades fall within feet of their positions, some for the first time confronting the fragility of life under fire. Yet, even amid this stark reality, a profound sense of camaraderie emerged. Shared hardship and the understanding that every individual's actions could tip the balance of life or death forged bonds that lasted decades. Veterans of the Ridge often spoke of this unity as one of the most enduring lessons. In combat, the individual is inseparable from the collective, and the discipline and courage of each person magnify the effectiveness of the whole. Finally, the Ridge engagement offers a broader reflection on the nature of history itself. Small-scale actions, often overlooked in grand narratives of war, can embody lessons of extraordinary value. 300 Marines, by their endurance, foresight, and skill, shaped the perception of American military capability in the Pacific. They demonstrated that doctrine, when paired with preparation and human resolve, could defy expectation and produce results disproportionate to numbers. The Ridge stands as a reminder that history is often determined not only by sweeping campaigns, but by the decisions and actions of individuals operating under intense pressure. In the years following the war, the Ridge became a locus of remembrance. Monuments were erected, and veterans returned to tell their stories. Military historians referenced the engagement to illustrate principles of defensive warfare, operational art, and psychological resilience. Every foxhole, every scar on the terrain, every anecdote of vigilance and precision contributed to a deeper understanding of what it meant to confront overwhelming odds with determination and skill. In the final analysis, the Ridge encapsulated the paradoxical nature of warfare, that vulnerability, when met with discipline, insight, and adaptability, could be transformed into an instrument of power. The Marines' steadfastness, the Japanese miscalculations, the meticulous preparation, and the intense psychological resolve of a small force combined to produce an outcome that reverberated far beyond the immediate battlefield. For 300 Marines, for their commanders, and for the broader strategic landscape, the Ridge became more than a location. It became a testament to what disciplined, courageous, and intelligently led soldiers could achieve under the most daunting conditions imaginable. Years after the Ridge engagement, the survivors carried with them memories that were as vivid as they were haunting. For many, the battle had been a crucible, forging bonds that could never be broken. Private First Class James O'Connor, who had stood in his foxhole throughout the barrage of Japanese attacks, later recalled in a post-war interview how the fear and tension had been constant companions, yet somehow, through it all, a sense of purpose had prevailed. Every Marine understood that their survival and that of their comrades depended on precision, vigilance, and unhesitating action. There was no room for doubt. Hesitation could mean death. That clarity of purpose, forged under fire, would define their lives long after the last shell fell. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Wenzel, reflecting decades later, often emphasized that the battle was as much psychological as it was physical. The Japanese had believed that cornered Marines would panic, yet the Americans had demonstrated a profound resilience under extreme duress. It wasn't luck, Wenzel would say. It was discipline, preparation, and the refusal to accept the assumptions of the enemy. That insight would resonate not only with those who had fought, but with military thinkers seeking to understand the dynamics of small unit combat. The Ridge became a case study in how terrain, training, and morale could invert the expected outcome of an engagement, demonstrating that numerical superiority alone did not guarantee victory. The engagement also had a lasting effect on Japanese operational thinking. After the catastrophic losses inflicted by what they had assumed would be a trapped and helpless force, commanders became increasingly wary of direct frontal assaults on well-prepared American positions. The psychological shock of repeatedly underestimating the resolve of United States Marines instilled caution in subsequent campaigns, reshaping tactical calculations across the Pacific theater. Historians have noted that this small engagement, involving just 300 Marines, contributed to a broader shift in how Japanese forces approached assaults on fortified American positions, a change that would influence battles from Peleliu to Okinawa. On the American side, the battle reinforced lessons that would inform training for years to come. Infantry schools, officer candidate programs, and unit-level exercises emphasized the integration of terrain analysis, interlocking fields of fire, and flexible command structures. The ability of small, well-led units to exert disproportionate influence on the battlefield became a central teaching point. For young Marines arriving in the Pacific, the Ridge was cited not merely as a historical episode, but as an enduring blueprint for effective defense under overwhelming pressure. Manuals and after-action reports highlighted the importance of observation posts, artillery coordination, and the disciplined use of limited ammunition, all lessons distilled from this singular engagement. Equally important was the human element. Survivors spoke repeatedly of the camaraderie that had sustained them. Men relied not only on training but on trust in one another. When one Marine faltered or became disoriented, another was there to reinforce the position, redistribute ammunition, or call in supporting fire. These small acts, seemingly minor in isolation, accumulated to form a formidable defense. In this sense, the Ridge was as much a story of collective effort as it was of individual heroism. Each Marine understood that their actions were inseparable from the actions of those around them, creating a network of interdependent courage that no enemy force could easily overcome. In broader terms, the Ridge engagement became emblematic of a central paradox of warfare. That vulnerability could be transformed into strength when met with preparation, discipline, and adaptability. The Americans' ability to turn a perilous situation into a decisive advantage challenged conventional military assumptions of the era. It underscored the principle that small, determined forces, when properly led and supported by sound tactics, could achieve outcomes far beyond what numbers alone might suggest. For military historians, the battle remained a vivid illustration of the interplay between human psychology, tactical innovation, and the material realities of combat. Ultimately, the Ridge was more than a tactical engagement. It was a lesson in resilience, leadership, and the enduring power of human determination. Those 300 Marines, by standing firm against overwhelming odds, left a legacy that extended far beyond the jungle they defended. They reshaped enemy expectations, informed future American military doctrine, and provided an enduring example of what disciplined, courageous, and adaptable soldiers could accomplish in the face of near-impossible odds. Their story continues to resonate, reminding us that in war, as in life, courage guided by preparation can turn the most dire circumstances into a defining moment of triumph. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.